Hey guys, let's finish the Civil War. So, the period after the Civil War ended was called the Age of Reconstruction. So, the war tore through the United States for 4 years, through the 1860s, and um, now we need to figure out what to do, right? When the war ended, we decided that it was the best idea to come back together, but there was a lot of issues still. 13th Amendment was working on getting passed. Lincoln is recently assassinated. Like, where do we go from here? So that's really what characterizes this period of Reconstruction is, well, what do we do now? Let's do it and hope for the best. So, under Lincoln's plan, he wanted to welcome the South back with malice towards none. That's a quote from one of his speeches. Malice meaning hatred. So he wanted the Union to come back together. No hatred against the South. We'll just come back. Everything's fine. It was called the 10% plan. This is because at least 10% of a state's voters have to pledge loyalty to the United States and support emancipation. And if they could manage that, then the state could come back into the Union. And I know 10% sounds like a really small amount of people. Um, But keep in mind, the goal was to get the states back together. And if you demand like 90% of people to agree on one thing, you'll never get it. Like if you ever tried to pick out a movie with your friends, like it takes forever. So 10% was a pretty reasonable number for them. So I know we've talked about how Lincoln was the first Republican president. And like any political party, there are radicals and there are, the crazies. So we have some radical Republicans. They believed Lincoln was being way too easy on the South and letting them just come back into the country was a bad idea. They wanted to punish the Southerners for leaving. They demanded civil rights for freed men, like freed slaves. Um, and they wanted to provide protection with Union soldiers across the South. So they wanted to keep Union soldiers in the Southern states, which, if you're trying to rebuild a country and keep the peace, throwing soldiers at the people you just defeated probably isn't the best idea. So we have the Wade Davis bill. This was drafted by those radical Republicans in 1864, so just before the Civil War ended, saying that 50% of voters must take the oath of allegiance. This was passed by both houses of Congress but vetoed by Lincoln. So I talked about a little bit ago the 10% plan. Like I said, if you have to try and get 50% of people to agree on one thing and something as controversial as slavery in the Civil War, that's going to be close to impossible. And I think Lincoln knew that, and that's why he vetoed it. So this is Andrew Johnson. He was Lincoln's vice president, so he took over when he was assassinated. He issued his own plan. So he calls for state conventions to repeal secession. So remember, to leave the Union, these states seceded. So he wants the states to like have a convention, government leaders, people like that, group up, and they say, okay, they make a decision. So he wants it to go that way. He eventually allows Southern states to rejoin the Union, but he was eventually impeached for fighting with radical Republicans who thought he was too lenient. So I'm sure you've heard a little bit about how Donald Trump was impeached this year. Impeached does not mean removed from office. A lot of people think that. No. Impeached does not mean removed from office. It just means that you are being charged with something. So if you're being charged with something, if you are found guilty, then it goes to removal from office. But he was just impeached. He was just charged, but he was never found guilty. Okay, so life during Reconstruction. There were carpetbaggers and scalawags, just some like negative nicknames people were called. Um, these were Northerners who moved south to make money. Were carpetbaggers. They could pack their stuff up in carpet bags and head down to south to sell it, or buy some land, stuff like that. So they were taking advantage of Reconstruction to make more money. And a scalawag was a Southerner who supported the Union. So that was just like a derogatory term that you could call somebody. The Freedmen's Bureau. This was an organization that helped former slaves with schooling, getting jobs, housing. Um, oh, just kidding. Remember we talked about Thomas Jefferson's quote, slavery is like holding a wolf by the ears. You let it go, it could turn on and bite you, it could run away. If you leave one hand on its ear, it probably will for sure come around and bite you. So after the 13th Amendment was passed and the Emancipation went through, there were just all of these people that had pretty much zero education, didn't have anywhere to live, didn't have places to go. So there had to be these organizations in place to help integrate these freed slaves into a free society. Elections. African Americans voted into office. Hiram Revels was the first American senator. This is a big deal, right? You go from being a slave to holding public office and influencing the laws. So we have the KKK. Um, these were former Confederate soldiers who terrorized slaves, freed slaves. The KKK does still exist today. It has a long and tragic history. Um, that's what your the worksheet I sent you is on. But yeah, you can do a lot of research. It didn't just end um, around this time. It is very much still a like even today. It's still around. Um, the KKK tried to get like crafty, and in the 1900s they would host community events and food drives and clothing drives and like children's things and um so like other than the fact that their sole purpose is to terrorize black people, they wanted it like gave the white people that were in it a sense of community. And that's also part of why they wanted to have it was come in, eat our food, come to our clothing drive, come to our carnival. Oh, by the way, here's our doctrine. It's crazy. You can Google it. You can find a lot about it. Okay, so, jeez. Sharecropping. Many former slaves worked plantations similar to slavery. So, like I said, you're a newly freed slave. You don't know how to read or write. All you know is farming. That's it. So, after you had your freedom, thanks to the 13th Amendment, like, where are you going to go? A lot of these major plantation farmers were like, "Oh, I'll just hire you back. You can keep working on this farm and I'll pay you, but I'll pay you and you can own part of the farm." Well, I mean, as you can probably guess, they didn't get paid enough and they didn't get enough land. So it was basically slavery, just with a little bit of money thrown at them. Um, Next, we have these thing called the Black Codes. These were laws passed in the South to limit the rights of blacks. So even though the slaves were freed, there were these codes, like Jim Crow laws, which we'll talk about, that were there to keep all of these freed slaves as less than. It barred them from a lot of things. So our formal generals, we have Robert E. Lee. He urges the Southern people to reconcile, to get back with the Union, to fix things. Um, he then served as president of Washington College. Ulysses S. Grant, remember he was the Northern general. He was eventually elected president in 1868. He advocated for the rights of freed slaves, and under his presidency, the 15th Amendment was passed. This guaranteed voting rights for all people. Okay, so that's technically the end of the Reconstruction period. The second part of your video will be the next half of these notes. So make sure you do that KKK assignment I sent you. Let me know if you have any questions.